Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great satisfaction that I announce that this is our final broadcast on Soren Kierkegaard's The 18 Upbuilding Discourses. And I am oh so thankful because Robert Schut covered for me this week. It was my turn to do the 18 Upbuilding Discourse. And I was preoccupied with a number of other educational materials that I was making, and Bob stepped up to the plate and substituted. So he will be leading the discussion today, and I will try to field any questions the best I can. So without further ado, I will let Robert Schut take it from here. I will say, Robert, and I don't want to celebrate a little bit too early, does it not feel good that we got through this 400-page book?
Oh yeah, it feels like an accomplishment. I gained a lot more insight into Kierkegaard. I saw a lot of common threads in the discourses that I've read before and some of his other ones where he developed the idea more fully. So I think this is all going to help us when we go and switch gears and start going into one of his major works. So yeah, and this is kind of the icebreaker for us as well. I think this is our first project together. So yeah, this will be kind of neat that we finished something.
Yeah, it's quite an undertaking. The other one, well, I guess I think we should let everybody know that we plan to take up the philosophical fragments. That is, in some ways, is an easier and more difficult project than what we've been doing here. What we take up in the philosophical fragments will be much shorter, but it'll be more rigorous from a philosophical perspective. But we can talk more about that another day. Why don't we? I think the tendency for these things is to these discourses to be rather long, so we should probably just jump right into it if you're ready.
Yeah, and that's I am, and yes, it's true. This particular one, I think it may have been his longest, if not, it's one of his longest, certainly. And I think what makes this particular one difficult is because he tries to deal with some very complex subject matter. Some of the ones he deals with prayer, the effects of prayer, what is prayer, which is mainly what this discourse is about. He touches on the mutability of God or the changeableness of God, and even the idea of good and evil. And those, of course, those are three major issues that people have encyclopedic works on. So trying to cover that in 20 or 23 pages is just monumental. But he starts off, this is again the fourth and the last discourse, the 18th discourse about prayer. And the quote that he uses, which he's kind of done throughout his other discourses, is one who prays aright, struggles in prayer, and is victorious in that God is victorious. And I just noticed that I was looking at some of my notes and I looked this up, and this is a smaller version of something that he quotes from his journals. And the full quotation is, by struggling aright in prayer, the marvel comes to pass that God in heaven and you are victorious, because you are victorious and that God is victorious. So it's just kind of a little bit of a different way of presenting the same thing.
Right.
So the first thing he starts off with is the meaning of prayer. So I thought I'd start off with, what does prayer mean to us? Okay, so
do you want
on
to talk about?
On a personal level, I thought we should open it up and say, in the past, trying not to be too influenced by what we've just read, what did prayer mean to you up till this point?
Boy, I think I've never really tried to put it into words before. I think, but I would. So I will say that how Kierkegaard writes definitely affected the way that I view prayer. And I had this epiphany while reading Kierkegaard, not the 18 Upbuilding Discourses, but when I was reading The Sickness Unto Death and the Concept of Anxiety. Mm-hmm. And when I was reading those texts, and those texts specifically deal with sin, despair, and anxiety, and I was reading these things as how-to guides, right, as existentialist how-to guides to get myself out of that form of existential bankruptcy or depravity. And I realized there was something super ironic about that, right? That I'm reading about these things. And I was like, this is silly. I need to be praying. And so now, and I always thought it was silly. Before I read Kierkegaard, I always felt it was silly to ask God for help with my my existential issues, for despair and anxiety. I always thought that they were too small for God in some way. And now I find, and this is unconnected to what we're going to, I'm sure you'll weave what I'm saying into the rest of the discourse here. But now I find if I ever am in the midst of depression, or if I'm having a panic attack, something I've struggled with my entire life is OCD and all sorts of crazy anxiety. Like the very first thing I do is turn to prayer now. And it is so remarkably helpful. But if I had not been reading Kierkegaard and experienced like this duality of like, why am I reading about how to properly affect my existential state and not doing something faithful about it?
Yeah. Okay. So, that's a great answer. Yeah.
Yeah. So I that's the first time I've ever put that really on camera and told anyone about it in this sort of forum. But I highly recommend that people who struggle with depression and despair and stuff like that to do everything that they can to get their mental health issues manageable. But something that I feel like is left out of the mix of medication and therapy and everything like that is having a very developed prayer life. And that is something that really meant all the difference for me.
Yeah. And I on the same note, I agree. I think that there's a lot more to our faith, psychologically speaking, than just a religion.
Yes.
And when I teach the Bible, even in the Old Testament, I don't view it as just isolated, disconnected stories that happened way back then. I read them and I say, what psychological value is in these stories for me? And I've discovered a wealth of information that has helped me, especially, in the teachings of Christ and that, like you say, folds right into the idea of prayer. For me, I have different kinds of prayer. I pray in a more formal manner. Maybe, well, all my prayer is more of a conversation with God. It's really talking to Him. But sometimes it's a little bit more formal conversation. Like my bedtime prayers. The last thing I want to think about before I go to sleep is God, and so I make that connection with God before I sleep. And the first thing in the morning, when I wake up, is I pray again. So I have that. I start the day and I end the day with God, and that's good for me. That wasn't always the way I did things, but that's how it's developed.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Oh,
I'm super curious because I don't think people talk about the prayer life enough, especially in regards to philosophy. It's hard for me to say that I have a conversation with God when I pray, because I don't think God necessarily speaks to me in words all the time. Like, I think, not that God can't do that. I think there are certain books and conversations and peoples and stuff, like people who may be acting on God's behalf. But when I pray, I don't necessarily hear the voice of God, but I will say that I feel that God communicates Himself to me, and by comfort and by a feeling of being understood. It's more of God communicates to His presence to me, I guess, through a form of existential understanding. Is that different from how you experience it? Do you? And I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you feel like,
no?
What's the nature of the conversation you think you have with God when you pray?
Yeah, well, it's different depending upon different things that I'm facing in my life. Like I say, sometimes it's more of a conversation. God, watch over my family, watch over me, take care of these things. Sometimes it's for healing. If there's somebody I know who I pray that He would touch them with healing. And then there's some times where the prayers come from a very deep emotional sense, something that I can't deal with emotional. My psyche just is overridden or flooding over or flowing over with emotion. And talking about other people is kind of out of the question.
Right.
And so I let this flow into prayer with God. And that's probably the most authentic prayer that I have. Is, as Paul says, it's not even the words, it's more of a groaning with prayer. It's like,
Right.
I don't even know what words to use. I'm feeling so much either grief or fear, or, like you said, whatever psychological needs I have at the time. And so it's almost a groan. It's, God, I don't even know what to say. But many times, by the end of my prayer, things get clearer. And the way I look at that is that you say you don't hear the voice of God, but think about it a little differently. Maybe the voice of God is in your prayer. In other words, we are emulating Christ. And so it's not that we hear the voice of God back to us, but the voice of God is actually coming from us to God through Christ. So we're playing the role of Christ as the human, grieving and asking God. And so the clarity that we have is actually the voice of God in the form of Christ or the Holy Spirit coming from us to God.
You see, and that's really interesting. And I'm wondering if that's something that you got from this discourse, or if you read something else, or if you talked to someone else that made you think about it more along those lines.
I think it was cumulative, but you may not believe this, but I actually just had that thought this moment.
Oh, really?
As I was listening to you, and you said that, it just clicked when you said that. And it may have been because of this discourse that I was able to piece it together.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's really interesting, and we'll talk about it. We'll get into the text itself, but I really liked some of the analogies that Kierkegaard used. One of my favorite was how he I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but one of my favorites was how he analogized like the relationship between human and God, like a child who is scribbling this inchoate mess with their crayons or their pen or whatever, but really through the relationship with God, it actually helps to perfect this beautiful thing that you're trying to draw. And I thought that was a really eloquent way to interpret the symbiotic relationship between man and God. As how he perfects our innate abilities through that subjective relationship.
Yeah, we begin the work, but God finishes the work.
Right, precisely.
And it may not look like we expected it to look. It's going to be a whole lot more beautiful the way he finishes it than the way we do. So yeah, that's great. Yeah, and you don't have to worry about stepping on my lines because there's a lot of stuff in here. I'm not worried about that.
The one concern though I had about that, the one concern I had about that particular idea, and maybe I should leave it here and let you go back to the more structured lesson plan that you have, is that idea can easily be satirized, right, within public culture or whatever, with like athletes who are always like, I give it up to God, like when they hit a home run or something like that, like as if like Jesus is there helping them swing the bat, and there could be something potential. I mean, so Kierkegaard's analogy is a really beautiful one, but you could very easily satirize it and turn it into something kind of silly and profane too. But
well, if we look at that kind of prayer as the scribbling, where the athlete, has a very childlike way of looking at God and his relationship, and that's kind of his scribbling, and God will work on that. And that's kind of how we have to look at it. Okay, I know you have a very immature way of doing that, but just kind of let it go. God will take care of it if he's open to it. So, yeah, I think we'll even talk a little bit about that. The transition from childlike faith to adult faith. I've got a little section on that.
Cool. So yeah, why don't you just go with what you've got planned?
Okay. Well, and I know I tend to be structured, and this is one of the things I always start thinking, okay, I'm going to make this more of a dialogue, but it never turns out that way.
Robert, I am so thankful that you were so structured. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. So we begin with the struggle. And most think that a person wouldn't enter into a struggle unless they had a chance of victory. And if you knew you were going to win at something, then you would justify the struggle. So it's kind of like basic idea. The basic logic is if you know you're going to lose, just don't bother with the struggle. Find something else to do. And then he talks about the victory. And each one, and you got to keep in mind, as we go through each one of these things, he touches on this a little bit, and then he changes subjects, touches on something else, and then he comes back to this again later. So we're not done with the struggle by any stretch of the imagination, but this is just how it kind of opens up our mind. And I think he does this because we have to remember that these are like sermons. He doesn't call them sermons only because of his status as he's not a pastor, I guess an official pastor. The discourse is a lot like a sermon. And sermons aren't really meant to give us all the answers. They're more meant to kind of pique our curiosity over the subject. And so that's one of the things I had to fight with when I read this, is how do I turn this into something knowledgeable? Because this is more piquing my interest. So where are the answers? So we have to struggle through, and I think that's how he writes a lot of things. He makes us really struggle to get to the answers. He makes us work for the answers. So he certainly made me work in this particular discourse. So back to the victory. No matter how much the odds are in our favor, the victory is still uncertain until it's actually won. If you are told that your opponent is so weak that your victory is inevitable and the struggle is just going to be a show, then the victory is still, even then, it's still uncertain until it happens. But under such conditions, does the contender, in other words, the person entering into the struggle, always doubt that there's going to be a victory? So does he always go in with his doubt and say, well, no matter how strong I am and how weak my opponent, I don't know, maybe he's going to get lucky and maybe I'm going to lose. So that's what he's kind of getting at. Should we always go into this kind of a struggle? And he says, no, there are certain circumstances where you enter into a struggle and you know you're going to be victorious. So he lays out this he turns everything upside down and he says, let's have a struggle. But in this case, the victor is the one who loses. So in that case, you're almost guaranteed that you're going to win. So he kind of accomplishes his point by turning everything upside down. Not necessarily that we run into those kind of struggles in life, but he's going to present prayer as that kind of a struggle. But if we try to explain that kind of a definition as to victory as the loser, it would probably be laughed at by most people. He said, that doesn't make any sense, that the one who loses is actually the victory. But eventually he will get to that. But the next thing he's going to tell us about is, as he defines it, is the battleground. Which he finds is a strange term to use when we're praying. The battleground. This is when do we enter into prayer as a battle? So what is the nature of the struggle that he's talking about? He says, so when we enter into prayer, he says we have to think of it as a struggle. We usually don't consider it as a struggle, but prayer is something, he says, that most people think as being a cowardly way to handle your problems, a feminine way.
To classify that as a more masculine perspective, a feminine perspective, I think these terminologies are ultimately unhelpful and I wouldn't endorse them. But yeah, I've seen it both ways. I've seen people made stronger by faith, and I've seen people talk about faith in ways that they think it makes the individual weaker. But it's my personal perspective that, I don't know, I feel like I can weather anything now as a result of faith.
So what prayer's done is it's made you more self-confident to rise above how the world is going to label you as masculine or feminine or whatever. That doesn't matter anymore. It's more, now you know who you are, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, all that matters is how God perceives me.
Yeah. Good. But yeah, I'm pretty much with you. That's how I felt. I felt a lot more independent from the world, but dependent upon God. Kind of odd way to put it. But he talks about this this battleground and this struggle, and he gives us he sets, I guess, a visual idea that if man is separate from God in a very wide distance, where he's so separate that he doesn't even really pray, or his prayers are so trivial that the distance is so great between him and true God that there really is no struggle. There's no battleground because you're just too far away to be in a battle or in a struggle. And at the same time, if you are so close that you have such a unity with God that almost like his thoughts are your thoughts and your prayers reflect his consciousness, then there's no room for struggle there either. So his struggle, he's saying, takes place that in-between distance where you're not so isolated from God and your prayers are really meaningful and passionate and authentic, but you haven't yet come to that total closeness with God, that total unity with God that you're looking for. So he says he's defining that's at the battleground. So we can see it if we want to use that visual idea. So we have to kind of, I guess, stand back a little bit and decide at where we are with this distance to see how close are we to God, or how far are we from God. Because if you don't notice any struggle in your prayer, then it's either one or the other. Either you're so far from God that you need to get closer, or you're so close to God that you don't need this. Then he opens up another topic, the price for the highest is what he calls it here. He says value in our world is usually associated with supply and demand. What's scarce is something that's usually valued as something more higher than something that's just very common. But is this true of spiritual things? Can we really put a value of spiritual things are either at a high or at a low? Or I think he got at the idea that, do they ever go on sale? Is there a good time to buy spiritual things? Kind of like a Black Friday or something like that. You go in and, hey, I can get my spiritual things at a discounted price. He says, no, absolutely not. Spiritual things always cost the same price.
Right.
Do you know what that is, Luke?
Well, I know what he's responding to.
Okay.
And I could postulate, but I mean, the thing is, I think what he's responding to there is at least how Christendom at that particular time, in Lutheran Denmark, was that, they were starting to approximate a lot of the practices of the Catholic Church that Luther rebelled against, in terms of, that there were fees for baptisms and this and that. And it comes out especially in his screeds against the church in Denmark, in his posthumous work. Well, I don't know if it's posthumous. It was the last chapter of it's posthumous, but the first 9 chapters he saw the release of. The moment where he's deeply critical of there being a price, a worldly price being put on these things. Mm-hmm. But I could speak elsewhere about what the cost is of having this spiritual things. And I mean, as we'll look in the philosophical fragments, there's a relinquishment of, or a relinquishing of one's objective understanding of faith, and giving one's over to a subjective commitment. But what do you have in mind here?
Well, Kierkegaard says if there were a set price for spiritual things, the problem would be that would exclude certain people and allow other people. So those who were rich or wealthy would be able to purchase faith. Those who didn't, or if they had more education, right? Or if they could speak Latin, or if they had a certain rank within the church, right? This is going to be loyal Kierkegaard, yeah. Right, exactly. So he says that the price is everything. So you have to give everything up if you want to have a true spiritual relationship with God.
Right.
So whether you only have 1 penny or whether you have $1 billion, it all in one frame of mind has to be given up. Or like you said, education or whatever resources, it all has to be given to God.
What do you think that means? What do you think it means to give everything up? Because I mean, do you think that means that we're all supposed to just live in total poverty? I mean, I certainly don't engage in the excess, but I have this functioning internet connection that allows us to create these educational materials, and all the resources in my life are orchestrated in such a way to perpetuate this good. But what could it be said that I'm not giving everything up in the right way? How do you understand that stake?
Well, let's take around the Middle Ages. We had what's called mendicant monks. I don't know if you're familiar with those. Those are people who gave up everything,
right,
so they could be monks. But how did they get by? Well, they begged from everybody else. They begged from the wealthy.
Yes.
So doesn't that sound a little hypocritical? You give it all up.
So didn't go to a monastery, right? I mean, and Kierkegaard himself, lived off of an inheritance while he was writing all these books, right? And coincidentally, he died like the day that all his money ran out.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, how do you?
Well, I see it.
So how do we hit that middle ground?
I think we tend to translate this as money too often and too frequently. I think what he's going to say here, and if we go back to our last week's discourse on resolution, I think is where we find the answer. The idea is if you're going to make a commitment with God, you have to be willing to make a total, full commitment with God. God's going to be the center of your life. I think that's what he's getting at. You have to give up everything, because I think what you said is very true about the night of resignation. That was his point. The night of resignation has to be ready to give up everything and then act upon it to become a night of faith. So, yes, I think that we have to be prepared in this discourse as well to give up everything. Now, I was going to add that another way to make it available to everybody is set a really low price for it.
He's not going to be happy with that, I'm sure.
But then Bonhoeffer comes to mind, where he talks about cheap grace.
Right.
Where the value is placed so low that it's no longer appreciated by us.
Right.
And was Bonhoeffer's whole statement. So it has to be placed at a value so that we can maintain its value, but at the same time make it affordable to everyone.
Right. So it's like available to everyone, but everyone has to enter into the struggle so it doesn't become devalued. I think maybe something we might want to expand upon, and I'm not sure how good a job he does here, is, he speaks a lot about struggle, but do we really understand what spiritual struggle is? We know that it involves being involved in God, and even when we lose and God wins, then everybody wins. But we might want to tap into some of the resources that we developed earlier to get an understanding of what spiritual struggle is. But I'm sure you'll say more about that. So I don't have a clear conception of how to speak about struggle here in this 18th discourse.
Okay.
I think that you have a better one, and I'm sort of anticipating, I think, what looks like to be your notes on that.
Okay. If I do miss it, let me know at the end.
Sure.
So we can talk about it a little bit. Then he calls this person the sensate person. Sensate here means the sensual person, the external person, the person who is motivated by the external things, the unspiritual person, rather than the internal person. He says he doesn't really understand this idea of the sacred nor of the good fight, which is the term used by Paul, meaning the fight of faith. So the sensate person doesn't understand these things. And he certainly doesn't understand the idea of the victor being the one who loses. He thinks differently much more differently than the spiritual man. He's more involved in himself, and everything he sees and hears, he translates into how he can use them to become wealthier or to become more famous. Everything is centered around himself. This is the sensate individual. So his goals are the goals that are most important. So for him to say to lose is to gain would be laughable in his eyes. So now he goes into the victory. He's going to explain a little bit more about the victory and losing. And he goes back to the idea of the resolution. How do we create, and we talked about struggle. What is the authentic struggle here? I mean, there's different ways of struggling. You know, we struggle if we don't get what we want in our prayer. But is that what he's talking about here? If the person doesn't begin with the resolution or the commitment to God, then they're trying to cheat God. They're holding back from God. They're being the cowards that we talked about last week, those who finding excuses why I shouldn't have a commitment with God. I don't have all my theological questions answered. You know, I have certain things I have to do in life, certain fun I want to have in life before I do it. Or like Constantine, you know, I have to be the emperor first, then on my deathbed I'll become a good Christian. So he talks about those as being the cowards. So even in this discourse, it begins with that, the struggle begins with the commitment. If you don't have the commitment, then there's nothing to struggle with. If one doesn't really suffer the loss and the pain and allow themselves to suffer, then they can't fully be involved in the struggle either. So if you're going to fight against the struggle itself, you're not going to benefit from the struggle. So not only do you have to struggle, but you have to allow yourself to enter into this struggle wherever it takes you. You have to be willing to pay the full price in a certain sense. So if a person is looking for certainty, I think he calls this probability. He never defines probability in his discourses, but I kind of take probability to mean certainty. So before I finish my sentence, is that how you would take his meaning of probability?
I mean,
I'm sorry. I know it's a hard one, but I never really found him explaining probability, so I kind of had to kind of put it together in my own sense that if I replace the word with certainty, it seems to work. So for now, we'll just say it's some kind of certainty, this idea of probability. So if we're seeking this kind of certainty before we make a commitment, then we'll never actually enter into a commitment with the eternal, because that certainty or probability is an illusion. It never really comes about.
Yeah, that's why. So that's why I hesitated with the equation of certainty with probability, because for Kierkegaard, there is going to be very little certainty that it is going to be sort of probabilistic. But with probabilistic stuff, I don't like the idea of that, because it oftentimes indicates that it can go either way. Yeah. But you know, if you don't have some sense that that what you're doing could actually obtain, then you know.
So by probability, I took him to mean 100% probability. You know, I get this. I'm certain about this, right? Well, that's how I took it. Maybe other people reading it might take it differently, and they can get back to me on that. I'd be curious. Okay, now he's going to have to help us out here with authentic prayer. You know, we all pray, but is our prayer really authentic? At least according to him and what he's discovered about it. Prayer does offer a sense of a spiritual reward that's not understood by the sensate or the sensual person. To such a person, an eternal reward just isn't understood. He's looking for something in the immediate, in the now, the temporal. He wants his temporal reward. You know, I'm praying for a new car. I'm praying for a new house. I want it now, right? And it's urgent. Got to have it now. If the person does make an eternal resolution and he actually grasps the eternal, then he becomes a true individual and he owes no one anything. I think this is interesting because that's just what you were saying earlier. Through prayer and through your commitment, you've discovered your own true individuality, and you don't really owe anybody anything for it. Because you've kind of risen above people singing, "We accept you, Luke. You're one of us now, so you're okay." You're willing to go out and struggle in your struggles, which are many, because you have your eye on the eternal, not on the temporal. He says no one can bring you to this resolution, but at the same time, no one can take it away. So that's kind of self-assuring that no matter what happens, you don't have to give up your commitment to God. Nobody can actually take it away. You've got to give it up if you're going to get rid of it. Now, at the same time, what does this mean for the evangelist? It's kind of, I thought about this. So what does that mean for the person going out and teaching and preaching? Is he just kind of flapping his mouth then if it's got nothing to do with him? I think that we can lead a person presenting the gospel and spiritual understanding to a person, but simply because we do that and maybe play beautiful religious music in the background to coerce them to make a commitment, I think what we're doing is creating an inauthentic commitment. So as an evangelist, we want to be careful that we present the gospel so the commitment is between the individual and the gospel, not between the individual and us and the gospel. And so this idea of, and this is what I've been exposed to in many places, where the sermon comes and then the music is in the background, and there's a lot of other psychological tricks and what would we say, little hand movements that's going on in the background, and then we get the person to finally make a commitment to God. But I think we, as teachers and pastors and evangelists, need to say, do we just want a commitment, or do we want an authentic commitment?
Well, I think that Kierkegaard was very concerned with, right, is that he's like, look at, we live here in Christendom, Denmark, in the 19th century, and I'm surrounded by good Christians, right? Like, the census says that we are a Christian country, but then he asks, he's got to ask, are people authentically devoted to God?
Yeah.
And obviously he thinks the answer is no, that they're kind of just culturally Christian. I think, I wanted to offer a little bit of an aside because I wanted some clarification on this from your life experience and your theological perspective. Something I've been considering a little bit lately about tempting God by praying in a certain way. And I think we've talked about it a little bit so far in relation to praying for some particular set of material circumstances to obtain, right? It seems like super silly. Last night on Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown, and I sort of alluded to this example of what I think tempting God would be, which would be like praying for a fancy car or something like that, or praying to hit a home run or whatever else, right? Like these seem to be like silly requests to make for God, but they seem less silly like in sort of graver scenarios, right? Like where we try to enter into this negotiation of God, if you just remove this cancer from me or sin or make them live forever or whatever else, what disanalogous in some way, or are they the same, or are they the same? The attitude of the different supplicants seems like there's a pretty wide gap between them. In effect, they're both asking for God to sort of grant a wish rather than to continually enter into this prayer life that like is renewed through inwardness, which is what this discourse is going at. How do you understand that, and how do you make sense of it? And I don't know, hopefully that's not derailing this conversation too much, but I think it's an important distinction to make about things. So I just want to know if you would take a second to speak about that.
Okay, if I remember correctly, the idea of tempting God goes back to one of our earlier discourses, and it's when we disregard God's will in this. We try to overpower God with our own will.
Right.
We say, "This is what I want, God," and it's inauthentic in that sense, and it's tempting God to change his will, is what
right.
the bottom line
right.
is.
Trying to make ourselves more powerful than him, right?
Right, yeah. Whether it's we pleading with him, whatever we're doing, we're trying to change his mind. And that was the idea. Kierkegaard was how he was defining tempting God. And the way I look at it is that there are people in the world who are needful. They're praying for something, their car is broken, they just got a new job, and they're trying to, support a family, and they really need this car fixed. So bringing that to God in prayer, I mean, whether I have a problem with it or not probably doesn't mean anything, but I don't have a problem with it. I mean, a person is praying for their daily needs. That's like asking God for their daily bread.
Right.
It's just what you need in order to make your daily bread. And I see prayer as something that is very individual to the individual. And it's a means by which, as we'll see, a means by which God transforms us. So even if we enter into a prayer, like you say, I need something that's really not important. The prayer itself is important in that you're entering into dialogue with God, and now it's in God's hands. Now God can take the person.
And ultimately, right, in this dialogue with God, it's whether the conditions that you want, be it surviving chemotherapy or whatever, it's that whatever the outcome is that you've submitted to God's will. Ultimately, like, it's not that praying for like someone who's in need, right, is necessarily problematic, so long as we are subordinate to God's will and we are brought in harmony with it at some point. It would be the way to think about it.
Yeah.
Pray for the person who's got cancer and they may not recover, but so long as my perspective is, the good Lord taketh, the good Lord giveth and the good Lord taketh away. So long as that's the perspective that I'm converted to in the process of that prayer life, then it's okay to pray for a person who's in need. Yeah.
And I don't know, just kind of a picture crossed my mind, and this may be completely off here in visualizing this, but when you go to college and you go to classes, sometimes you have to take a class you don't want to take. Maybe it's music appreciation or art appreciation or something, and you're saying, this is the least class I want to take here. I've got better things to do. I'm a philosopher. What do I need to know this for? But you take it because you need to fulfill a particular obligation. And you go to the class, but you say to yourself, well, I'll at least be open-minded. And you listen, and you say, not too bad. That's kind of interesting. And by the time you finish that semester, you now really know a lot more about art, a lot more about music. It's a lot more interesting to you, and your life has been enriched by it. Think of prayer in the same way. Maybe you enter into it reluctantly, or maybe immaturely, or as a child. But if you come into it with an open heart and with that commitment, after time, God is going to use that occasion of prayer to transform you into what he wants you to be like, no matter how you enter into it. Did I miss the target on that one? Or
no, I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think we're in agreement.
Okay, good. And Next, he gives us another story. He gives us the story of the letter to a friend. He talks about prayer in the sense of writing a letter to a friend. And I know probably a lot of pastors have used this in their sermons, writing a letter to God. So this is probably a pretty common concept. But he says if the letter is not addressed properly, it's not going to be delivered to the right address. You can write as many letters as you want and be as sincere as you want in the content, but they won't be delivered to your friend, especially if you forget to put the stamp on it. So you've got to have the letter in the right structure, so to speak. But the question is that really what he's talking about? Is he talking about structured prayer? Like you have to say the Our Father 5 times in the Hail Mary and the act of contrition, and you have to say these memorized prayers? No, that's not what he's talking about here. But he reminds me of a quote from Isaiah, which is from Isaiah 29, verse 13. And he says, therefore the Lord said, inasmuch as these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts from me, that there were certain consequences, that they would not have their answers. So he's talking about inauthentic prayer, people who are praying with their mouths and their lips, and they're saying all the right words, but their hearts are far from me. That's an inauthentic prayer, and that's what he's kind of getting at here. The proper labeling of the prayer is the idea that we must be committed to it, and we must be open-hearted, have unity of heart with it. And then he gets into the childish understanding. I found this really interesting, too, in this part. He talks about a child's relationship with God, that he gives thanks to God when anything good happens, when he receives something, especially at Christmas time. His mom will say, at least in Denmark anyway, will say, well, this is a gift from God, and the child is so excited. Oh, God, thank you. Today it's usually Santa Claus gets all the credit now. But and let's just say in Denmark, they didn't do that. In Denmark, the child got the toy and was thankful to God. But how does the child relate to things like pain and sadness and unpleasant things of God? Right? How does he do that? Is God, and that brings up the question, for us, is God just all the good things? Does he have any traits that might not fit into our category of good? How do we deal with the categories of justice, integrity, righteousness? They don't always appear good to everybody, right? People who want to live a life of crime really don't see justice as something good, but they see justice as something coming after them, something to even the score. So the idea of God being good is something that we're all taught, but it needs qualification. God is not, it's like love. God is not just love. And I in my class, I always say, God isn't just a big hippie where the only thing in his world is love. He doesn't have a headband on up there and sandals, like people in my generation in the 60s thought of God, that he was a hippie God. He loves everybody, and you don't need to do anything. He loves you. I learned, God is a righteous God. He's a just God, and he has integrity. So there's other qualities that God has other than just mere love. Have you kind of, you're not as old as I am, so you didn't go through the 60s so much.
Well, I think hippies are forever with us.
Well, yeah.
As I signed up for that Hawthorne seminar, I think the transcendentalists were kind of the proto-hippies. And there's a lot of nostalgia for what went on in the 60s in 2016. I mean, especially there are a lot of people that still believe they are living in that era. And in fact, Kierkegaard speaks about that as a form of escapism.
Yeah.
who don't want to confront reality, is that they kind of wish that they were born in a different decade, either in the future, or they long for a past that they saw as nobler or purer, simpler, rather than deal with the complicated reality of the moment. So although I'm not old enough to have attended Woodstock, it does not take much imagination for me to get a sense of what it must have been like to be there, or what was going on.
Okay. Well, Kierkegaard actually kind of gives us that idea here too. If we read hard and long into this discourse, he has that lesson as well. So if we look at the child now, the child has to now deal with the bad that happens in his life. How does mom explain this to the child? Well, one of the ways he says is that she says, well, bad is caused by bad people. That's why there's evil things happen in the world. That's why we have bad things happening. It's the bad people that do this. It's not, God has nothing to do with these things that are happening that might not be so pleasant. So the distress, sometimes the child might see his mother going through distress, maybe a divorce, or maybe something else in her life. And she has to try to explain, well, this isn't caused by God, this is caused by something else, some isolated circumstance. Then he talks about something even more devastating. What if the child's father dies? How does the mother explain this? Well, usually the mother will say, well, dad is in heaven right now. He's in heaven with God. And so the child accepts this as a good explanation and is satisfied with it. And of course, it doesn't matter what kind of father the father was. The father could have been an ogre. The father could have been a beast, an abuser, or whatever, but the answer is still pretty much the same. You know, dad's in heaven now with God. He's walking with Jesus, you know, and enjoying his life. The child is completely comfortable with this idea, but he doesn't really grasp the full concept of God here. He's only given what mom wants him to know to kind of assuage or lessen his feeling of the tension between good and evil. And these ideas are really above the child. And what the mother is trying to do here, he says, is to preserve the inwardness of the child's spiritual integrity, the inwardness of that relationship between God and goodness, so that the child doesn't see anything of reality going on, but somehow tries to relate everything to the good.
Yeah, I've seen this in my own life. I have a friend who has her firstborn son passed away from a brain tumor, but she also had her second son was 2 years younger, and he has faint memories of his brother, and will say that he's like with God or with Jesus or whatever, and like he is content. His innocence is preserved as a result of that narrative, but she frequently can tell that she's happy that innocence is preserved, that inwardness, that connection to God is preserved in the innocent child. But you can also tell that you can also tell that there's the spiritual struggle still there for her and for us all. But yeah, I think she listens to a lot of her stuff, so I don't be upset with me sharing that story. She's a pretty amazing woman.
Good.
So.
Good. And we'll probably deal with that a little bit here too, is how do we get beyond that? But one of the questions I wrote down is, and it does not pertain to what this woman is doing, so I don't, because I didn't even know that story, but is it really possible to preserve spiritual integrity by means of a lie? Is it okay to lie to our children about God, that everybody goes to heaven, or whatever it takes to keep this child's spiritual integrity? Is it okay to tell them lies, to make up stories?
Well, do you think Do you think we are making up stories when we do that? See,
I think when we tell people, let me give you a version of, let's say, a lie here in the sense of we don't really know. That we say that a person who's, let's say, been an atheist all his life, but he's a dad, and he's a good dad,
yes.
Okay? And he dies. And then we tell the children, well, Dad's in heaven with Jesus.
Yes,
well,
okay.
That's not really the truth. At least our integrity is now in question, because do we really believe that? And if we don't believe it, why are we passing that down to others? Okay, so that would be the
yeah, I think in that example, that makes more sense to say that it's uncertain. Or in the example that I was thinking of from my personal life, since the child was so young that passed, like, to me, it's more certain that that child is in heaven.
Okay.
Right, because the child passed at 4 years old. There was no chance for it to fall. There was no chance for the child really to sin.
Right. Yeah, and so, like I said, I wanted to isolate that from that particular situation.
The stories are different. Yeah.
So now we get to the point that how do we cross over? If we've raised the child with all these stories that God is good, and we kind of held back the justice from God, and we've held back the idea of righteousness from God, of good behavior and so forth, and we've protected his spiritual integrity, that God is only good things. What happens when the child becomes an adult? How do they deal with reality in their own lives? How do they deal with death of loved ones? How do they deal with catastrophes, natural catastrophes or human catastrophes?
Right.
How do they deal with war? Now that they don't really have a good sense of explanation, many adults simply don't want to go beyond that understanding of a child and take their faith seriously. So they maintain a certain kind of integrity, but it's a false integrity. Like, don't confuse me with the truth kind of an idea. I don't need to be serious about God like you are, because you're a religious fanatic. God's going to let all of us go to heaven because that's what I've always believed. In that kind of a situation. So what he continues on here, he says that when the sorrowful wife of the dead husband is in distress over his death, how does she explain that to the child? Perhaps she might resort to fables or tales whose purpose really isn't truth, but merely to help the child through the distress. So that becomes the priority of mom. Or this could be, Kierkegaard uses as a mother, but we could say father too. It isn't sexist here. The difficulty exists when these stories try to enter into reality. How do we address when we make that change into adulthood? It may have been easy for her to hide reality in this kind of a story when the child was young, but how does she explain evil to the child as being permitted by God, that God allows this to happen? As if God is responsible in the end, which Kierkegaard seems to think he is. If God lets evil happen, how could a good God let evil happen? So he gets into that kind of the good and evil versus evil idea. So how do we deal with that? And my question to Christendom in my country is, where do we get the adult version of the gospel? Where do we get to hear the adult version of the gospel? Because for me, my senses tell me we're not getting the full version of the gospel. We're getting the child version of the gospel because the adult version is just too much of an offense to hear. So we're getting a simplified, more like a childlike version of the gospel. So when do we hear the full version? And I'll kind of throw that as a it doesn't have a direct answer, but what does that question echo in your mind? What does that make you think about, if anything?
I mean, I think Kierkegaard sees himself as being us with the adult version of the gospel, right? And what does it mean to be adult, right? Like, there's a lot of different sort of evangelical thinkers and preachers and things like that who believe that they have like the sobering truth of the gospel. And, like, again, I keep referencing this Hawthorne seminar that I put together. Like, the Puritans were very concerned with preaching a concept of there being of damnation being a very real thing, right? And there was more emphasis put on that. And you could make the case that though that is like sobering in some way, that's an equally sort of childish way to think about the gospel, right? You're not emphasizing like angels playing harps in heaven, but you are thinking about like, all the tortures of hell. It sort of appeals to our more macabre horror movie imaginative process. And I think what Kierkegaard's trying to say, that the real adult version of the gospel is ambiguity. I don't see Kierkegaard talking a lot about the afterlife, but talking a lot about paradoxes and how they frustrate the prideful reasoning. So I think what Kierkegaard believes to be the adult understanding of the gospel to be that it's something that is not something just for the elites, is not something easily attained, but that it is complicated for everyone. And it's so complicated that everyone must struggle with it. Like, that's the real adult. But I don't know if that's the same question as that you're asking me. It sounds like you may be asking me, well, where do we get it within our contemporary society? I'd have to think on that one for a second. But I think that what I'm saying right now might be to what Kierkegaard believes adult theology should be.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you got it great. Actually, I thought your answer was more than I expected, because I think your ideas of the hellfire is equally as childish in a sense as everybody goes to heaven, and it's a place of rainbows and unicorns. Right. Because focusing on one particular part of the gospel, like you say, it appeals to the macabre in the sense of justice. We want justice, but what if now you've taken justice, but you've eliminated love? You need both of them, and that's the paradoxical idea of Kierkegaard, is that he struggles with this himself. I think his writings are a reflection of his own internal struggles with the adult gospel.
Right.
And so where do we get it? I think we get it, at least one place we can get it is his writings. I think we can see his sense of struggle and realize that, if we're not struggling with this idea, then we're not really fully engaged in it. So, if this is really easy for us and we say, I've got all the answers, then I have to say, are you really totally committed, and are you really listening to the whole gospel? So, and I think your answer was perfect.
No, thanks.
You're welcome. So let's see. So let's go down here now, back to the sensate person. He only knows God through the external, through the temporal, the material things. And he has no separation between himself and the external world. So we talked about separation between God and the individual, but here we're talking about it on a different scale. We're talking about it between the external man and between the material world. He says there's no separation. He's fully engaged in that world. But as far as his world between him and God, well, that's almost an eternity of distance between him and between the spiritual world. And because of that, the sensual man has no struggle with God. Everything is fine because there's no paradox. there's no difference. There's no struggle. He's not being transformed into Christ. So there's nothing going on in his life. He's totally united and totally happy in his external world. Some people pray and struggle to overcome God. And that's what we talked about earlier, the inauthentic struggle, or the, what was it again that you called it? The
tempting of God? Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah, the temptation of God is when you struggle to overcome God, to force your will upon God's. And sometimes when we do that, it even almost appears that our prayers are bearing fruit. Maybe sometimes when we pray for the car, lo and behold, we wind up with a new car. All right. So is that God answering our prayer? Is God giving in to our prayers? In the sense, we're so far from God that we fail to realize that we're not even connected. We're not even on the same page as God. So in a sense, we're deceiving ourselves with our own deception. Sometimes we hear, especially in theologies, that God never changes. He always stays the same. And such an idea upsets the one who struggles with his inwardness, because he thinks, well, if my prayers can't change God, then why am I here praying? What good am I doing? What good are my prayers doing if God isn't really listening to me? The changelessness of God puts God at a further distance sometimes in that manner, where we say, well, I want to pray that God heals me or heals my loved one, but if he can't change, then he's not going to change his mind about the disease. So why am I praying? And maybe sometimes many of us have entered into this discussion, at least with ourselves. We might not have the courage to ask God, why am I praying to you if you're not going to do anything? But we need to struggle with this as much as the child needs to struggle with their stories. Even if it becomes unanswered, the struggle will eventually bear fruit. So it's not something that I think we want to leave unanswered. It's something that's going to be a paradox. So God, saying the prayer, why am I praying if you're not going to change your mind, needs to be prayed if we have doubts in that area. So the God being prayed to is more human, he says, however. This is his contrast to that. The God that we're praying to is more human than that. He does hear our complaints, and he's moved by the prayer of the one struggling. So one might pray about a past horror and looking for comfort from that horror, or one might be afraid of some future horror that's about to come that seems to be inevitable. And he's coming to God with that need for an answer. So the ultimate victory for both God and for the one struggling. So how now does God resolve this struggle between God says it's only my will that counts, and man who says, well, your will doesn't seem to be doing it for me. How do I influence you? How do I get you to hear me? It's a matter of making, in his words, it's a matter of making ourselves clear to God by truly explaining to him what we really need and why it's beneficial. Trying to get him to consent to our prayer, to be assured that he really is a Father in heaven, listening to us. The struggle is evidence that one is praying in a sincere manner and not expecting childish answers. So if we enter into prayer saying, God, you're always good and you're going to good, so I know you're going to heal. I know you're going to do this good thing for me because I've defined it as good, is praying with the childish expectation. It's saying my ideas are childish and I'm not going to allow myself to be conformed to the mature gospel. But the person who enters into prayer with that complete resolution, that complete commitment, is listening to God as much as they are speaking to God. They're allowing God to make their prayers a means of transformation, as though, give me clarity, God. Am I coming to you in the right manner? Should I be asking for my prayers for my loved one to be healed? Is there something else I should be doing? So it's coming in with that sense of humility and that sense of unworthiness to God. This is a prayer I come to you to answer, Lord, not demand an answer because I know I'm right. So some think of prayer as an obligation or as a requirement of salvation, he says. In this case, it's thought to give us a sense of reward. If I pray hard enough and long enough and in the right way, I'm going to attain salvation. I think we get this. I got this as a child. When I committed a sin, my penance was to do 5 Our Fathers and 5 Hail Marys, an act of contrition. I entered into prayer with a sense of obligation. I have to say these prayers in order to get my sins cleared. So that's an idea of what he's getting at here. If it's not to get the result that we want, then what's the purpose of the struggle in prayer? And so now my comment is here is, do you have any comments on that? What did that kind of awaken in you when I talked about that?
So much.
Do you care to share?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think the thing is, right, is like even we do grow out of the childish conceptions and narratives that are passed down to us. Then, like, you still see this like on television shows and sitcoms and things like that. People for particular scenarios to obtain. I think what the really concerning thing is that God becomes a little bit like a genie in the bottle, right? Like that he's just like granting wishes, that he's like magic somehow or something like that. I can speak to what I think the real victory is, and I mean, this is drawing on a lot of Kierkegaard work, is to really feel at one with God. Like that's the ultimate victory, is to be like the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, to just be synchronous with the movements of the divine will. That's ultimately what the struggle gives way to. It's not that I'll be able to play some harp in heaven or avoid an incredibly hot fire in hell, or to get a car, but to sort of parallelism and serenity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
I don't know. I mean that's what I, so far in my spiritual is being directed by existential Christianity. That seems to be the case. It seems to be some sort of oneness with God.
Yeah, it's more than questions and answers. Sometimes that's kind of our childish way of looking at God. I got a question, I need an answer to it. The answer may be in the form of some spiritual theology that we don't understand. It might be in the form of my needs. I need a car. It could be childish. So yeah, I think that when we enter into prayer, we do that. And I think you kind of summarized Kierkegaard here and what his point is. I'll go in a little bit more to the details, of course, put some flesh on the bones, but I think that you nailed it in the sense of yeah, that's what we're looking for, that synchronicity with our Lord. But he gives it a little bit more clarity, perhaps.
Please go on.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he says, what is this victory then? He's been alluding to this throughout this whole thing here. What is the victory then? Well, you're victorious when God is victorious, and because God is victorious.
Yes.
Okay. So it's like having, and he gives us another little story. He says it's like having a conversation with someone who really is truly concerned with us. We have confidence in their wisdom, but we just happen to disagree with them on a particular point. So we believe that if we can come up with a good argument, a good, concise, logical argument, we can change his mind and he'll go along with us. So we struggle, with back and forth disagreements. He makes a point, I make a point, and we come down to it. And the struggle that we're talking about here is likened to the struggle in prayer, and that we really are trying to persuade the other person into coming along with our ideas. There's a separation of ideas here, which is that battleground. God thinks one way, we think another way. Our friend thinks one way, we think another way. And as the argument continues, the other person now, he begins to see his own argument with much clarity. He's now able to get agreement from his friend. But his friend shakes his finger at him, and he tells him that finally, he says, you agree with what I've been saying all along. So the point is, whose mind was actually changed during this discussion? The friend wanted to convince his wiser friend that he was right. But through the process of him taking his argument, it turns out that his mind was changed into the original argument that his wise friend had all along. So it was through the dialogue that his own thinking was made clear. And in the same manner, we struggle with God in prayer. In the end, our minds become more clear on what we're seeking, and we'll become more unified with God. So the one who struggles gets closer to God, and the inwardness becomes more important rather than the end result.
Completely, yes.
So this is what Kierkegaard, and this is what we're looking at when we look at him psychologically. This is why I kind of opened up with the psychological power of prayer.
Yes.
In that it changes our psyche into looking not only at God differently, but we look at ourselves differently as well. So we talk about the change in us. So who's victorious? Well, first of all, God is victorious. But the one praying has also become victorious because he's become transformed. His earthly wish was not the highest purpose here, but God's love for the one praying was. What's changed? Has God changed his mind in this? Well, we might say, if we say yes, then we might have a problem with the immutable qualities of God. He might have a problem because he defies our theology of God, that God can't change. But he didn't really change. What's changed here, and this is very perceptive of Kierkegaard, is his changelessness has changed in the sense that man now understands that quality in a different way. So it's not that God has become mutable or changeable, but we simply see God's changelessness in a different way. Does the one who prayed become changed? Absolutely yes, because now he prays more correctly, because he sees himself differently in this whole prayer relationship. So the struggle brings unity. His prayer helped him concentrate on his soul as one wish, or single-mindedness, union with God, or as Kierkegaard's one works that he has is purity of heart, which someday we'll do. So now man sees himself and his relationship with God as this purity of heart, this seeing one thing, this having this one goal with this to be in union with God. This is where I have a little criticism of Kierkegaard. I think that he doesn't explain this unity in better terms. I think he leaves it in more psychological terms rather than bringing it down to something more finished. See, I want to catch up on my notes here.
That's fine.
Yeah, how much understanding does God really give us here? He's only giving us enough understanding for our faith. In other words, it's not that God is trying to make us intellectual, spiritual beings, but he's trying to make us into faithful beings. And so that's the purpose of understanding. Too many people see understanding as an intellectual pursuit. I've increased my spiritual knowledge, and so that makes me a better Christian. But it's really, the knowledge is there so that you know who the source of knowledge is, therefore you can trust God even more now that you have that knowledge. So it's during these periods of the struggle that the explanation becomes clear and prayer becomes part of this process of transformation. This suffering that he talks about brings us to prayer, and prayer to clarity, and clarity to final victory, and that final victory is faith. So in conclusion, he takes our reason for praying through prayer and he creates something beautiful. This sketch now becomes finished through prayer. The sketch that we talked about with the child. Yes. He transforms the individual into a person that he needs to be. And both God and the man are both victorious. God is victorious because he never changed his answer as the one struggling requested, but succeeded in transforming him through his prayer of struggling. And the one praying is victorious because he's now been transformed more into the image of Christ. This, I think, what he says here is true of some prayer, as we talked about. And this is why I opened up with what does prayer mean to us. I think when we come to God and we struggle for God for certain reasons to become a better Christian or have a more clear understanding of faith, I think this discourse is helpful with that. Becoming a better Christian, absolutely, because we understand prayer, we understand ourselves. But there's sometimes, and many times, we pray in a different manner. We come to God in a sense of agony. We've lost someone we love, or we simply have we need to